A bird in hand is worth two in the bush for these three reasons. 1. A bird in hand is less risky than two in the bush. 2. Just because you have a bird in hand today doesn't mean you can't get the two in the bush tomorrow. And 3. A bird in hand today is more use to you than the potential for two in the bush. A bird in hand is less risky than the two in the bush because a bird in hand is a bird you know you have. The two in the bush are unknowns, they're variables. You're not sure if you can get them or not, but the bird in your hand, you know you have. There's less risk involved with something you know you have. And just because you have a bird in hand today doesn't mean you can't have those other two in the bush later. To let that bird in hand go to try for the other two in the bush would be foolish. Maybe today the technology doesn't exist that you can have one in your hand and catch the other two in the bush for a grand total of 3 birds, but that doesn't mean it won't exist. That doesn't mean that there won't be a way that you can keep your bird and have the other two in the bush. Sometimes it's possible to have your cake and eat it too, and this is an instance where just because you have a bird in hand doesn't mean you should let it go to try to get the other two in the bush. Lastly, a bird in hand is more useful than two in the bush. 2 birds in a bush are 2 birds you can't use. A bird in hand is a bird you can use. A bird in hand is a bird that can sing for you if it's a songbird, talk back to you if it's a parrot. A bird in hand is a bird you can bond with. 2 birds in the bush are still wild. 2 birds in the bush aren't going to form any meaningful connection for you, aren't going to serve any aesthetic purpose, no companionship purpose, but a bird in hand will. A bird in hand is a bird you can depend on. It's a bird that you know you have. Whereas the 2 in the bush, as previously mentioned, are unknowns. They're variables. You're not sure whether or not you can get these 2 birds. But a bird in hand is a bird you have. So a bird in hand is worth more in the bush for these reasons. There's less risk involved with a bird in hand because it's a bird you have. 2, just because you can't have the bird in hand and the 2 in the bush today doesn't mean you can't someday. And 3, a bird in hand is a bird you can use. Thank you.